In March 1987, an unconventional giant rolled into the limestone quarries of southern Indiana. Music. It hadn't arrived on railroad flat cars or been transported in pieces. It simply showed up, driven by its own crew, and what made it extraordinary wasn't just its size, but what it had cost to build. Almost nothing. This articulated dump truck, capable of hauling 45 tons of material in a single load, had been assembled using scrap parts, military surplus, and the pure ingenuity of a small mechanical shop in southern Illinois. It was painted an odd mix of primer gray and faded olive drab, stood 4.2 meters tall, stretched 12 meters long, and rolled on 6 massive mismatched tires. Music some called it the Frankentruck. Others simply called it proof that American resourcefulness hadn't died in the Rust Belt. This is the story of how a bankrupt construction company needed something they couldn't afford, how a father and son team of mechanics refused to accept the word impossible, and how this cobbled-together machine helped save a family business, while showing that sometimes the best engineering comes not from corporate design teams, but from dirt under fingernails and desperation in the bank account. Henderson Heavy Equipment was founded by Music Robert Henderson in 1954 in Carbondale, Illinois. What began as a two-man operation repairing farm equipment and welding broken tractor frames would transform into a respected heavy equipment service provider throughout the southern Illinois coal country. The Henderson family had a reputation for fixing what others said was unfixable, constantly music jury-rigging solutions that kept aging machinery running long past its designed lifespan. By the early 1980s, Henderson's son, Michael, had joined the business full-time after spending 6 years as a heavy equipment mechanic in the Army. Together, Music father and son operated out of a corrugated steel workshop on the outskirts of town, servicing excavators, dozers, and haulers for the local coal mines and quarry operations. Their shop hummed with activity 6 days a week, stopping only for the occasional holiday. They weren't getting rich, but they were making it work. Then came the recession. The early 80s hit the construction and mining industries like a sledgehammer. Music interest rates soared above 20%. Construction projects dried up overnight. Coal demand plummeted as factories shut down across the industrial heartland. By 1983, Henderson Heavy Equipment was struggling. Their client base had shrunk by 60%. Several major customers had gone bankrupt, owing them money. The Hendersons were 3 months behind on their mortgage and seriously considering shuttering the business. Enter Midwest Stone and Gravel. The company's origins trace back to 1962, when the three Kowalski brothers purchased a played-out limestone quarry near Bloomington, Indiana. What most people saw as a worthless hole in the ground, music, the Kowalskis recognized as an opportunity. The deposit wasn't exhausted, just poorly managed. They brought in proper surveying equipment, mapped the geology correctly, and discovered the limestone extended much deeper and wider than previous operators had realized. By 1975, Midwest Stone had become one of the most productive quarries in the region, supplying crushed aggregate for highway projects across 3 states. They operated a fleet of aging equipment, music, mostly second-hand machines, purchased at auction, and kept running through constant maintenance and repair. Unlike competitors who bought new machinery on credit, the Kowalskis bought cheap and fixed it themselves. The Great Recession hit them hard too. Music. In 1982, their primary hauler, a 20-year-old Euclid R45, suffered a catastrophic transmission failure. The repair quote came back at $48,000. A replacement truck, even used, would cost north of $120,000. They had neither. Frank Kowalski, the eldest brother and the quarry's equipment manager, started making calls. He needed something that could haul 30 to 50 tons of crushed limestone from the pit floor to the processing plant roughly 2 kilometers uphill. Music. It didn't need to be pretty. It didn't need to be new. It just needed to work and cost almost nothing. Someone mentioned the Henderson shop down in Illinois. They'd heard stories about Michael Henderson building a farm tractor entirely out of parts salvaged from 3 wrecked machines. Music about Robert Henderson fabricating a replacement boom for an excavator using structural steel from a demolished grain elevator. If anyone could build a hauler for next to nothing, it would be them. In November 1984, Frank Kowalski drove to Carbondale with a proposal that sounded insane. He wanted the Hendersons to build him a dump truck, not repair one, build one. From scratch? Using whatever they could scrounge, salvage, or buy dirt cheap. His budget was $12,000. Music for context, a basic new hauler in 1984 cost between $150,000 and $200,000. Even a thoroughly worn-out used truck would run $30,000 to $40,000. Kowalski was asking for the impossible. Robert Henderson's first reaction was to laugh. His second was to start thinking. Music. Michael's reaction was immediate interest. They had the skills, they had the workshop, they had time since work had slowed to a crawl. What they didn't have was money, which made this the perfect project. If they pulled it off, it could generate enough cash to keep the lights on. If they failed, they weren't any worse off than they already were. What emerged from this desperation was unprecedented. Over the next 14 months, the Henderson team would scour junkyards, attend bankruptcy auctions, and trade favors with every mechanic, welder, and equipment dealer within 200 kilometers. So they started with the frame. At a military surplus auction in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, Michael spotted a 1968 M123 truck tractor, one of the massive 10-ton trucks the Army used to haul tanks and heavy equipment. It had been sitting in a boneyard for 8 years. The engine was seized, the cab was destroyed. But the frame, suspension, and axles were solid. He bought it for $1,800. That frame became the foundation of everything. It measured 9.7 meters long and was built from thick steel channel designed to carry 70 tons of payload. Music, the front axle and steering system came with it, along with massive reduction hubs designed for off-road punishment. They hauled it back to Carbondale on a borrowed lowboy trailer. For engines, they needed serious power. Available diesel engines in 1984 that could move a 45-ton load cost $10,000 to $15,000. Used. The Henderson solution was unconventional. Music. At an equipment auction in Evansville, they found a wrecked Caterpillar D8 dozer. The tracks were destroyed, the blade was gone, and the hydraulics were shot. But the Caterpillar D343 diesel engine still ran. It was an older model, naturally aspirated, producing around 280 horsepower. Not enough for what they needed. Robert bought the entire dozer for $3,200, planning to resell the other parts. They pulled the engine and transmission, music, then spent 6 weeks rebuilding both in their shop. Michael fabricated a custom turbocharger mounting system using parts from a Detroit Diesel Series 60. They had no dyno to test it on, but calculations suggested they'd boosted output to somewhere around 360 horsepower. Enough to get the job done if they geared it right. Behind the engine, they needed a transmission capable of handling that torque. New heavy-duty transmissions cost $15,000 to $20,000. Music. Michael remembered seeing an old Allison CLT 755 transmission at a salvage yard in Paducah, pulled from a 1970s-era transit bus. These transmissions were legendary for their durability and had been used in some early off-highway equipment before being phased out. The salvage yard wanted $800. Michael offered $400 and a case of beer. Music. They settled on $500 and the beer. The transmission needed extensive rebuilding. New clutch packs, seals, and a modified valve body to handle the higher torque. Robert spent 3 weeks on it, working nights after their regular repair jobs. When they tested it on the shop floor, it shifted smoothly through all 5 gears. It would work. For the rear axles, they caught an incredible break. A coal mine near Marion was liquidating equipment after shutting down. Music among the items at auction was a wrecked Dart D400 articulated truck from the mid-1970s. The front half was destroyed in a pit wall collapse, but the rear section, including both axles, the dump bed pivot point, and the hydraulic systems, was intact. Michael bid $2,000 expecting to be outbid. Nobody else wanted it. Music. They hauled the entire rear section back to the shop. Those axles were exactly what they needed, already designed for off-highway use, with planetary reduction hubs and air-actuated differential locks. They were also already set up for the articulated steering system they'd need. The articulated joint itself required custom fabrication. This was the trickiest part of the entire build. Music. An articulated truck pivots in the middle, allowing the front and rear sections to bend independently. It provides incredible maneuverability, but requires precise engineering to handle the stress loads. Robert and Michael spent weeks designing the joint using graph paper, reference books from the library, and advice from an engineer friend who owed Robert a favor for rebuilding his fishing boat. They fabricated the articulated joint from 2-inch thick steel plate using heavy-duty pins salvaged from earth-moving equipment and sealed bearings designed for agricultural machinery. Music. The hydraulic steering cylinders came from a surplus paving machine. When assembled, the joint could articulate 40 degrees in either direction and was massively overbuilt to handle any conceivable load. For the dump bed, they returned to that Dart D400 rear section. The original dump bed was damaged but repairable. It measured 3.4 meters wide by 4.9 meters long and 1.8 meters deep. Music. Michael and a helper spent 2 months cutting out the damaged sections, welding in new steel plate and reinforcing the structure. They fabricated new side panels from 1/4-inch steel plate purchased as scrap cutoffs from a local steel yard for $300. The hydraulic lift system came with the Dart rear section. A single massive hydraulic cylinder mounted at the front of the bed could lift 45 tons to a 45-degree dump angle. They rebuilt the cylinder with new seals and tested it with the bed empty. Music. It lifted smoothly and held pressure for 12 hours without dropping. Good enough. For the cab, they got creative. A wrecked 1979 Ford LTD 9000 semi-truck provided the starting point. The cab was structurally sound but cosmetically destroyed. Music. They cut it from its frame, modified the mounting points, and fabricated a custom adapter to mount it on the M123 frame. The cab sat high, providing good visibility, and already had basic controls and a decent seat. They kept the original steering wheel, pedals, and dash, modifying the wiring to control their hodgepodge of systems. The hydraulic system required careful integration. They needed hydraulics for the steering, the dump bed, and the differential locks. Music. A hydraulic pump from a wrecked forestry skidder provided the main power. They fabricated a custom mounting bracket to drive it off the engine's power takeoff. New hydraulic lines ran throughout the machine, using a mix of new and salvaged hoses, fittings, and valves. The entire hydraulic system cost $800 in new parts, plus scavenged components. Tires presented a significant challenge. New off-highway tires in the size they needed cost $2,000 to $3,000 each. Music. They needed 6. Michael found 4 used tires at a mine equipment dealer in West Virginia, worn but serviceable, for $500 each. 2 more came from an equipment rental company in Kentucky that was liquidating inventory. They were different brands and showed uneven wear, but they held air and had enough tread left. The electrical system was entirely custom. Music. Michael spent weeks routing wiring, installing switches, and building a custom fuse panel. The lights came from various sources: headlights from a farm tractor, tail lights from a highway truck, work lights from a construction equipment yard. None of it matched, but all of it worked. The most expensive single electrical component was a new alternator for $240. By January 1986, the machine was taking shape in the Henderson workshop. It looked like exactly what it was: a mismatched collection of parts from a dozen different sources. Music. The military olive drab of the original M123 frame blended with the primer gray of welded repairs. The red Caterpillar engine sat under a hood fabricated from flat steel plate. The Ford cab perched atop the frame like an afterthought. The dump bed wore its original faded yellow paint with bare steel patches where repairs had been made. But when Robert turned the key on a cold February morning, the engine fired immediately. Music. The transmission shifted smoothly through all gears. The hydraulic system responded crisply. The articulated joint pivoted freely. Against all odds, the thing actually worked. They spent the next 6 weeks testing and refining. The brakes needed adjustment. The steering required fine-tuning. They added grab handles, mirrors, and a backup alarm. Music Michael fabricated a ladder to access the cab. Robert installed a fire extinguisher and basic tools in a welded storage box. They painted "Henderson Built" on the door in hand-brushed letters, more as a joke than anything else. The final accounting came to $11,400, $600 under budget. Music. That included everything: the M123 frame, the Caterpillar engine, the transmission, axles, hydraulics, tires, electrical system, fabricated components, welding supplies, and countless small parts. They'd spent 14 months of occasional work, done mostly in spare time between paying repair jobs. In March 1987, Michael drove the finished truck from Carbondale to the Midwest Stone Quarry near Bloomington, a 200-kilometer journey on secondary roads. Music. Maximum. Speed. 55 kilometers per hour. The truck handled well, tracked straight, and didn't shake apart. When he arrived at the quarry, Frank Kowalski stood with his brothers, staring at the creation with a mix of amazement and concern. It didn't look like much. But when they loaded it with 43 tons of crushed limestone, and Michael drove it up the winding haul road to the processing plant, dumped the load, and returned for another, the Kowalskis realized they'd gotten exactly what they needed: a working dump truck that had cost roughly 8% of what a new machine would have cost. The Henderson Hauler, as it came to be known, worked at Midwest Stone for the next 9 years. It hauled limestone, gravel, and overburden through blazing summers and brutal Indiana winters. Music. It broke down regularly. The electrical system needed constant attention. The engine required rebuilding after 18 months. The transmission failed twice, the tires wore out, and were replaced with whatever used tires they could find. The hydraulic hoses leaked and burst with depressing regularity. But every time something broke, the Kowalskis or the Hendersons fixed it, usually within a day or two. Music. Because the machine had been built from common salvaged parts, replacements were cheap and available. When the Caterpillar engine finally wore out in 1991, they replaced it with a Cummins diesel from a wrecked highway truck for $3,200. When the Allison transmission grenaded in 1993, they installed a Fuller transmission from a salvage yard for $900. The truck's existence did something unexpected. Word spread through the quarrying and mining communities about the machine the Hendersons had built. Music. Other operators facing similar financial pressures started calling. Could the Hendersons build them something similar? Could they modify existing equipment? Could they fabricate custom solutions? By 1989, Henderson Heavy Equipment had pivoted from general repair work to specializing in custom builds and major modifications. Music. They built 3 more haulers using similar scavenged parts approaches. They fabricated custom excavator attachments. They converted highway trucks into off-road haulers. They modified dozers and loaders in ways manufacturers would never support. Michael Henderson discovered he had a talent for unconventional engineering. He could look at a pile of junk and see possibilities. Music. He understood how to adapt components designed for one purpose to serve another. He knew which corners could be cut safely and which absolutely could not. His military experience had taught him that equipment doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to work reliably under the conditions it will actually face. The second hauler they built went to a gravel pit operation in southern Missouri. That operator had even less money than Kowalski, just $8,000. Music with the Hendersons built him a smaller machine using a frame from a 1960s Army deuce-and-a-half truck, an engine from a wrecked farm combine, and a dump bed fabricated entirely from scratch. It could haul 28 tons and looked even more cobbled together than the original. But it worked for 7 years before the operator finally upgraded to a used commercial hauler. The third machine went to a small coal mine in eastern Kentucky. Music. That one used components from 3 different wrecked mining trucks, all purchased at the same bankruptcy auction for a combined $4,500. The Hendersons charged $12,000 for the fabrication work. The finished machine could haul 52 tons and actually looked somewhat professional, painted in a uniform dark green with proper lighting and safety equipment. The fourth and final hauler built using this approach went to a rock quarry in Tennessee in 1994. Music. By then, the Hendersons had refined their process considerably. They knew which components worked best, which suppliers had the best salvage inventory, and how to fabricate custom parts more efficiently. That machine cost the customer $18,000 and was the most sophisticated of all their builds, incorporating some new safety features and modern hydraulic controls alongside the salvaged major components. But the industry was changing. Environmental regulations tightened throughout the 1990s. Music emission standards for diesel engines became progressively stricter. Insurance companies began refusing to cover equipment that wasn't built by certified manufacturers. OSHA inspections became more frequent and thorough. The era of building heavy equipment in an independent workshop was drawing to a close. The Hendersons recognized this reality. Rather than fighting it, they adapted. Music in 1995, they became an authorized service center for Caterpillar. In 1997, they added Komatsu to their credentials. They still did custom fabrication work, but now it was mostly attachments, modifications to existing equipment, and specialized repairs rather than building entire machines from scratch. By 1996, the business was thriving. They'd hired 6 full-time fabricators and mechanics. They'd expanded the workshop twice. They were no longer desperate. They were successful, specializing in a niche nobody else wanted, building custom heavy equipment for operators who couldn't afford new machinery but needed something that worked. The original Henderson hauler was finally retired in 1996. After 9 years of hard use, everything had been rebuilt or replaced at least once. Music. The frame was cracked in multiple places. The articulated joint was worn beyond safe limits. The cost of keeping it running had finally exceeded its value. Frank Kowalski drove it to the Henderson shop one last time, and they parked it behind the building. Robert Henderson wanted to preserve it. It represented everything the presented. Business had become our music. But they needed the space, and scrap steel prices were good. In 1998, they cut up the machine and sold it for scrap. The Caterpillar engine went to a farmer who wanted it for a generator setup. The Allison transmission was sold to an equipment rebuilder. The rest became raw material for new steel production. Before they scrapped it, Michael took detailed photographs and measurements. Music. He'd been thinking about writing up the build process, maybe submitting an article to one of the equipment trade magazines. He never got around to it. The photographs sat in a drawer for years, occasionally shown to visitors who asked about the legendary machine, but otherwise forgotten. In 2003, an engineering student from Southern Illinois University contacted the Henderson shop. He was writing his thesis on improvised engineering solutions in heavy industry. Music. Someone had mentioned the Henderson hauler. Michael spent an afternoon showing him the photographs and explaining the build process. That thesis became the most complete documentation of the project, including detailed analysis of the engineering challenges and solutions. The student, whose name was Brandon Mitchell, went on to become a design engineer for a major equipment manufacturer. Music. He later said that studying the Henderson hauler taught him more about practical engineering than 4 years of textbook learning. It showed him that real-world problems rarely have textbook solutions, and that sometimes the best answer comes from working with what you have rather than waiting for what you wish you had. Henderson heavy equipment still exists today, though dramatically different from its desperate early 80s incarnation. Now music run by Michael's daughter, Sarah. The company operates out of a modern facility and employs 23 people. They still specialize in custom fabrication and creative solutions, but they're also an authorized dealer for several equipment manufacturers. The business Robert started in 1954 continues, now in its third generation of family ownership. Sarah Henderson never saw the original hauler. It was scrapped 2 years before she was born. Music. But she grew up hearing stories about it, about her grandfather and father working late into the night, welding steel and rebuilding transmissions, about the impossible budget and the desperate circumstances, about proving that American ingenuity still meant something when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Midwest Stone and Gravel continues operating under third-generation Kowalski management. Music. The quarry has expanded significantly and now operates modern haulers with load capacities exceeding 200 tons. But in the company office hangs a faded photograph of the Henderson hauler dumping its first load in March 1987, a reminder of when desperation and ingenuity saved the business. Frank Kowalski passed away in 2015. In his later years, he loved telling the story of the Henderson hauler. Music. He described driving to Carbondale with a proposal he knew sounded crazy. He'd laugh about his first look at the finished machine, thinking it looked like something from a post-apocalyptic movie. He'd get serious when he talked about how that ugly, cobbled-together machine had kept the quarry running during the worst years, bought them time to recover, and ultimately saved the family business. The legacy of the Henderson hauler lives on in ways its creators never imagined. Michael Henderson went on to teach classes at a community college on heavy equipment repair, music always emphasizing creative problem-solving over by-the-book solutions. Several of his students went on to start their own fabrication businesses. One of them, inspired by the Henderson hauler story, built a successful company, converting surplus military vehicles for civilian use. Another former student started a business specializing in rebuilding and reselling heavy equipment components. Music. He'd learned from Michael that a supposedly worthless junk machine often contained thousands of dollars in serviceable parts. That business now employs 40 people and supplies rebuilt components throughout the Midwest. What made the Henderson hauler extraordinary wasn't its size. Plenty of machines move more material. Music. What made it extraordinary was what it represented. Proof that expensive isn't always necessary, that ingenuity can overcome lack of resources, and that sometimes the best solution isn't what the manufacturer recommends, but what you can make work with what you have. The modern heavy equipment industry runs on standardization, certified parts, and manufacturer support contracts. Music, for good reason. Safety regulations have tightened. Emission standards have become strict. Liability concerns are real. The days of building a dump truck in your workshop from salvaged parts are largely over and probably for the best. But the spirit that drove the Henderson Hauler project hasn't disappeared. It lives on every time a mechanic looks at a supposedly unsalvageable machine and figures out how to make it run. Music. Every time a fabricator adapts a component designed for one purpose to serve another. Every time someone facing impossible circumstances refuses to accept defeat and instead asks, "What if we tried this?" That question, more than any specific machine, is what drove the golden age of independent American fabrication. Music. The Henderson Hauler was simply one visible answer to it, rolling on 6 mismatched tires through Indiana quarries, carrying 45 tons of limestone, and proving that sometimes the best engineering comes not from corporate design departments, but from a workshop where 2 men refuse to accept the word impossible. The quarries still need limestone. The crushers still need feeding. Music. And somewhere in southern Illinois, there's still a workshop where they believe that almost any problem can be solved with enough creativity, determination, and the willingness to build something that technically shouldn't work, but somehow does anyway.